I perfectly exhaust myself sometimes in pointing out the distinction to Edmund Sparkler." Mrs. Gowan, looking over her green fan when this young gentleman's name was mentioned, replied as follows: "My love, you know the wretched state of the country, those unfortunate concessions of John Barnacle's, and you therefore know the reasons for my being as poor as a thingamy." "A church mouse?" Mrs. Merdle suggested with a smile. "I was thinking of the other proverbial church person, Job," said Mrs. Gowan. "Either will do. It would be idle to disguise, consequently, that there is a wide difference between the position of your son and mine. I may add, too, that Henry has talent." "Which Edmund certainly has not," said Mrs. Merdle, with the greatest suavity. "And that his talent, combined with disappointment," Mrs. Gowan went on, "has led him into a pursuit which, dear me, you know, my dear, such being Henry's different position, the question is what is the most inferior class of marriage to which I can reconcile myself?" Mrs. Merdle was so much engaged with the contemplation of her arms, beautiful formed arms, and the very long thing for bracelets, that she omitted to reply for a while. Roused at length by the silence, she folded the arms, and with admirable presence of mind looked her friend full in the face and said interrogatively, "Yes, and then?" "And then, my dear," said Mrs. Gowan, not quite so sweetly as before, "I should be glad to hear what you have to say to it." Here the parrot, who had been standing on one leg since he screamed last, burst into a fit of laughter, bobbed himself derisively up and down on both legs, and finished by standing on one leg again and pausing for a reply with his head as much awry as he could possibly twist it. "Sounds mercenary to ask what the gentleman is to get with the lady," said Mrs. Merdle, "but society is perhaps a little mercenary, you know, my dear." "From what I can make out," said Mrs. Gowan, "I believe I may say that Henry will be relieved from debt." "Much in debt?" asked Mrs. Merdle through her eyeglass. "Why, tolerably, I should think," said Mrs. Gowan. "Meaning the usual thing, I understand, just so," Mrs. Merdle observed in a comfortable sort of way. "And that the father will make them an allowance of 300 a year, or perhaps altogether something more, which, in Italy—" "Oh, going to Italy," said Mrs. Merdle. "For Henry to study. You need be at no loss to guess why, my dear." "That dreadful art?" "True." Mrs. Merdle hastened to spare the feelings of her afflicted friend. She understood. Say no more. "And that," said Mrs. Gowan, shaking her despondent head, "that's all that," repeated Mrs. Gowan, furling her green fan for the moment, and tapping her chin with it. It was on the way to being a double chin, might be called a chin and a half at present. "That's all. On the death of the old people, I suppose there will be more to come, but how it may be restricted or locked up I don't know, and as to that, they may live forever. My dear, they are just the kind of people to do it." Now Mrs. Merdle, who really knew her friend's society pretty well, and who knew what society's mother were, and what society's daughters were, and what society's matrimonial market was, and how prices ruled in it, and what scheming and counter-scheming took place for the high buyers, and what bargaining and huckstering went on, thought in the depths of her capacious bosom that this was a sufficiently good catch. Knowing, however, what was expected of her, and perceiving the exact nature of the fiction to be nursed, she took it delicately in her arms, and put her required contribution of gloss upon it. "And that is all, my dear?" said she, heaving a friendly sigh. "Well, well, the fault is not yours. You have nothing to reproach yourself with. You must exercise the strength of mind for which you are renowned, and make the best of it." "The girl's family have made," said Mrs. Gowan, "of course, the most strenuous endeavours to, as the lawyers say, to have and to hold Henry." "Of course they have, my dear," said Mrs. Merdle. "I have persisted in every possible objection, and have worried myself morning, noon, and night for means to detach Henry from the connection." "No doubt you have, my dear," said Mrs. Merdle. "And all of no use. All has broken down beneath me. Now tell me, my love, am I justified in at last yielding my most reluctant consent to Henry's marrying among people not in society, or have I acted with inexcusable weakness?" In answer to this direct appeal, Mrs. Merdle assured Mrs. Gowan, speaking as a priestess of society, that she was highly to be commended, that she was much to be sympathized with, that she had taken the highest of parts, and had come out of the furnace refined. And Mrs. Gowan, who, of course, saw through her own threadbare blind perfectly, and who knew that Mrs. Merdle saw through it perfectly, and who knew that society would see through it perfectly, came out of this form, notwithstanding, as she had gone into it, with immense complacency and gravity. The conference was held at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when all the region of Harley Street, Cavendish Square, was resonant of carriage wheels and double knocks. It had reached this point when Mr. Merdle came home from his daily occupation of causing the British name to be more and more respected in all parts of the civilized globe, capable of the appreciation of world-wide commercial enterprise and gigantic combinations of skill and capital. For though nobody knew with the least precision what Mr. Merdle's business was, except that it was to coin money, these were the terms in which everybody defined it on all ceremonious occasions, and which it was the last new polite reading of the parable of the camel and the needle's eye to accept without inquiry. For a gentleman who had this splendid work cut out for him, Mr. Merdle looked a little common, and rather as if, in the course of his vast transactions, he had accidentally made an interchange of heads with some inferior spirit. He presented himself before the two ladies in the course of a dismal stroll through his mansion, which had no apparent object but escape from the presence of the chief butler. "I beg your pardon," he said, stopping short in confusion. "I didn't know there was anybody here but the parrot." However, as Mrs. Merdle said, "You can come in," and as Mrs. Gowan said she was just going, and had already risen to take her leave, he came in, and stood looking out at a distant window, with his hands crossed under his uneasy coat cuffs, clasping his wrists as if he were taking himself into custody. In this attitude he fell directly into a reverie, from which he was only aroused by his wife's calling to him from her ottoman, when they had been for some quarter of an hour alone. "Eh? Yes," said Mr. Merdle, turning towards her. "What is it?" "What is it?" repeated Mrs. Merdle. "It is, I suppose, that you have not heard a word of my complaint." "Your complaint, Mrs. Merdle?" said Mr. Merdle. "I didn't know that you were suffering from a complaint. What complaint?" "A complaint of you," said Mrs. Merdle. "Oh, a complaint of me," said Mr. Merdle. What may you have to complain in me of, Mrs. Merdle?" In his withdrawing, abstracted, pondering way, it took him some time to shape this question, as a kind of faint attempt to convince himself that he was the master of the house. He concluded by presenting his forefinger to the parrot, who expressed his opinion on that subject by instantly driving his bill into it. "You were saying, Mrs. Merdle," said Mr. Merdle, with his wounded finger in his mouth, "that you had a complaint against me." "A complaint which I could scarcely show the justice of more emphatically than by having to repeat it," said Mrs. Merdle. "I might as well have stated it to the wall. I had far better have stated it to the bird. He would at least have screamed." "You don't want me to scream, Mrs. Merdle, I suppose?" said Mr. Merdle, taking a chair. "Indeed, I don't know," retorted Mrs. Merdle, "but that you had better do that than be so moody and distraught. One would at least know that you were sensible of what was going on around you." "A man might scream and yet not be that, Mrs. Merdle," said Mr. Merdle heavily. "And might be dogged as you are at present without screaming," returned Mrs. Merdle. "That's very true. If you wish to know the complaint I make against you, it is, in so many plain words, that you really ought not to go into society unless you can accommodate yourself to society." Mr. Merdle, so twisting his hands into what hair he had upon his head that he seemed to lift himself up by it as he started out of his chair, cried, "Why, in the name of all the infernal powers, Mrs. Merdle, who does more for society than I do? Do you see these premises, Mrs. Merdle? Do you see this furniture, Mrs. Merdle? Do you look in the glass and see yourself, Mrs. Merdle? Do you know the cost of all this and who it's all provided for? And yet you will tell me that I oughtn't to go into society. I, who shower money upon it in this way. I, who might always be said to harness myself to a watering cart full of money and go about saturating society every day of my life? Pray, don't be violent, Mr. Merdle, said Mrs. Merdle. Violent? Said Mr. Merdle. You are enough to make me desperate. You don't know half of what I do to accommodate society. You don't know anything of the sacrifices I make for it. I know, returned Mrs. Merdle, that you receive the best in the land. I know that you move in the whole society of the country. And I believe I know, indeed, not to make any ridiculous pretence about it, I know, who sustains you in it, Mr. Merdle. Mrs. Merdle, retorted that gentleman, wiping his dull red and yellow face. I know that as well as you do. If you were not an ornament to society, and if I was not a benefactor to society, you and I would never have come together. When I say a benefactor to it, I mean a person who provides it with all sorts of expensive things to eat and drink and look at. But to tell me that I am not fit for it, after all I have done for it, repeated Mr. Merdle, with a wild emphasis that made his wife lift up her eyelids, after all, to tell me I have no right to mix with it after all, is a pretty reward. I say, answered Mrs. Merdle composedly, that you ought to make yourself fit for it by being more dégage and less preoccupied. There is a positive vulgarity in carrying your business affairs about you with as you do. How do I carry them about, Mrs. Merdle? Asked Mr. Merdle. How do you carry them about? Said Mrs. Merdle. Look at yourself in the glass. Mr. Merdle involuntarily turned his eyes in the direction of the nearest mirror and asked, with a slow determination of his turbid blood to his temples, whether a man was to be called to account for his digestion. You have a physician? Said Mrs. Merdle. He does me no good, said Mr. Merdle. Mrs. Merdle changed her ground. Besides, said she, your digestion is nonsense. I don't speak of your digestion, I speak of your manner. Mrs. Merdle, returned her husband, I took to you for that. You supply manner, and I supply money. I don't expect you, said Mrs. Merdle, reposing easily among her cushions, to captivate people. I don't want you to take any trouble upon yourself, or to try to be fascinating. I simply request you to care about nothing, or seem to care about nothing, as everybody else does. Do I ever say I care about anything? Asked Mr. Merdle. Say no, nobody would attend to you if you did, but you show it. Show what? What do I show? Demanded Mr. Merdle hurriedly. I have already told you. You show that you carry your business cares and projects about, instead of leaving them in the city, or wherever else they belong to, said Mrs. Merdle. Or seeming to. Seeming would be quite enough. I ask no more. Whereas you couldn't be more occupied with your day's calculations and combinations than you habitually show yourself to be if you were a carpenter. A carpenter? Repeated Mr. Merdle, checking something like a groan. I shouldn't so much mind being a carpenter, Mrs. Merdle. And my complaint is, pursued the lady, disregarding the low remark, that it is not the tone of society, and that you ought to correct it, Mr. Merdle. If you have any doubt of my judgment, ask even Edmund Sparkler. The door of the room had opened, and Mrs. Merdle now surveyed the head of her son through her glass. Edmund, we want you here. Mr. Sparkler, who had merely put in his head and looked round the room without entering, as if he were searching the house for that young lady with no nonsense about her, upon this followed up his head with his body and stood before them, to whom, in a few easy words adapted to his capacity, Mrs. Merdle stated the question at issue. The young gentleman, after anxiously feeling his shirt-collar as if it were his pulse and he were hypochondriacal, observed that he had heard it noticed by fellers. Edmund Sparkler has heard it noticed, said Mrs. Merdle, with languid triumph. Why, no doubt everybody has heard it noticed, which in truth was no unreasonable inference, seeing that Mr. Sparkler would probably be the last in any assemblage of the human species to receive an impression from anything that passed in his presence. And Edmund Sparkler will tell you, I dare say, said Mrs. Merdle, waving her favourite hand towards her husband, how he has heard it noticed. I couldn't, said Mr. Sparkler, after feeling his pulse as before. "Couldn't undertake to say what led to it. Cause memory desperate loose, being in company with the brother of a deuced fine girl, well educated too, with no big old nonsense about her, at the period alluded to." "There, never mind the sister," remarked Mrs. Merdle, a little impatiently. "What did the brother say?" "Didn't say a word, ma'am," answered Mr. Sparkler. "As a silent a feller as myself, equally hard up for a remark." "Somebody said something," returned Mrs. Merdle. "Never mind who it was." "Assure you I don't in the least," said Mr. Sparkler. "But tell us what it was." Mr. Sparkler referred to his pulse again, and put himself through some severe mental discipline before he replied. "Fellows referring to my governor, expression not my own, occasionally compliment my governor in a very handsome way on being immensely rich and knowing, perfect phenomenon of buyer and banker and that, but say the shop sits heavily on him. Say he carried the shop about on his back rather, like Jew clothesman with too much business." "Which," said Mrs. Merdle, rising, with her floating drapery about her, "is exactly my complaint. Edmund, give me your arm. Upstairs." Mr. Merdle, left alone to meditate on a better conformation of himself to society, looked out of 9 windows in succession, and appeared to see 9 wastes of space. When he had thus entertained himself, he went downstairs and looked intently at all the carpets on the ground floor, and then came upstairs again and looked intently at all the carpets on the first floor, as if they were gloomy depths, in unison with his oppressed soul. Through all the rooms he wandered, as he always did, like the last person on earth who had any business to approach them. Let Mrs. Merdle announce, with all her might, that she was at home ever so many nights in a season, she could not announce more widely and unmistakably than Mr. Merdle did that he was never at home. At last he met the chief butler, the sight of which splendid retainer always finished him. Extinguished by this great creature, he sneaked to his dressing-room, and there remained shut up until he rode out to dinner with Mrs. Merdle in her own handsome chariot. At dinner he was envied and flattered as being of might, was treasuried, barred, and bishoped as much as he would, and an hour after midnight came home alone, and being instantly put out again in his own hall, like a rushlight by the chief butler, went sighing to bed. Chapter 34. A Shoal of Barnacles. Mr. Henry Gowan and the dog were established frequenters of the cottage, and the day was fixed for the wedding. There was to be a convocation of barnacles on the occasion, in order that that very high and very large family might shed as much lustre on the marriage as so dim an event was capable of receiving. To have got the whole Barnacle family together would have been impossible for 2 reasons. Firstly, because no building could have held all the members and connections of that illustrious house. Secondly, because wherever there was a square yard of ground in British occupation, under the sun or moon, with a public post upon it, sticking to that post was a barnacle. No intrepid navigator could plant a flagstaff upon any spot of earth and take possession of it in the British name, but to that spot of earth, so soon as the discovery was known, the Circumlocution Office sent out a barnacle and a dispatch box. Thus the barnacles were all over the world in every direction, dispatch boxing the compass. But while the so potent art of Prospero himself would have failed in summoning the barnacles from every speck of ocean and dry land on which there was nothing except mischief to be done and anything to be pocketed, it was perfectly feasible to assemble a good many barnacles. This Mrs. Gowan applied herself to do, calling on Mr. Meagles frequently with new additions to the list, and holding conferences with that gentleman when he was not engaged, as he generally was at this period, in examining and paying the debts of his future son-in-law in the apartment of Scales and Scoops. One marriage guest was there, in reference to whose presence Mr. Meagles felt a nearer interest and concern than in the attendance of the most elevated barnacle expected, though he was insensible of the honour of having such company. This guest was Clennam, But Clennam had made a promise he held sacred among the trees that summer night, and, in the chivalry of his heart, regarded it as binding him to many implied obligations. In forgetfulness of himself and delicate service to her on all occasions, he was never to fail. To begin it, he answered Mr. Meagles cheerfully, "I shall come, of course." His partner, Daniel Doyce, was something of a stumbling block in Mr. Meagles' way, the worthy gentleman being not at all clear in his own anxious mind but that the mingling of Daniel with official barnaclism might produce some explosive combination, even at a marriage breakfast. The national offender, however, lightened him of his uneasiness by coming down to Twickenham to represent that he begged, with the freedom of an old friend, and as a favour to one, that he might not be invited. "For," said he, "as my business with this set of gentlemen was to do a public duty and a public service, and as their business with me was to prevent it by wearing my soul out, I think we had better not eat and drink together with a show of being of one mind." Mr. Meagles was much amused by his friend's oddity, and patronized him with a more protecting air of allowance than usual, when he rejoined, "Well, well, Dan, you shall have your own crotchety way." To Mr. Henry Gowan, as the time approached, Clennam tried to convey by all quiet and unpretending means that he was, frankly and disinterestedly, desirous of tendering him any friendship he would accept. Mr. Gowan treated him in return with his usual ease and with his usual show of confidence, which was no confidence at all. "You see, Clennam," he happened to remark in the course of conversation one day, when they were walking near the cottage within a week of the marriage, "I am a disappointed man. That you know already." "Upon my word," said Clennam, a little embarrassed, "I scarcely know how." "Why," returned Gowan, "I belong to a clan, or a clique, or a family, or a connection, or whatever you like to call it, that might have provided for me in any one of 50 ways, and that took it into its head not to do it at all. So here I am, a poor devil of an artist." Clennam was beginning, but on the other hand, when Gowan took him up, "Yes, yes, I know. I have the good fortune of being beloved by a beautiful and charming girl whom I love with all my heart." Is there much of it? Thought Clennam. As he thought of it, felt ashamed of himself, and of finding a father-in-law who is a capital fellow and a liberal good old boy. Still, I had other prospects washed and combed into my childish head when it was washed and combed for me, and I took them to a public school when I was washed and combed for it myself, and I am here without them, and thus I am a disappointed man. Clennam thought, as he thought it, again felt ashamed of himself. Was this notion of being disappointed in life an assertion of station which the bridegroom brought into the family as his property, having already carried it detrimentally into his pursuit, and was it a hopeful or promising thing anywhere? "Not bitterly disappointed, I think," he said aloud. "Hang it, no, not bitterly," laughed Gowan. "My people are not worth that, though they are charming fellows, and I have the greatest affection for them. Besides, it's pleasant to show them that I can do without them, and that they may all go to the devil. And besides, again, most men are disappointed in life, somehow or other, and influenced by their disappointment. But it's a dear good world, and I love it." "It lies before you now," said Arthur. "Fair as this summer river," cried the other with enthusiasm, "and by Jove I glow with admiration of it, and with the ardour to run a race in it. It's the best of old worlds, and my calling, the best of old callings, isn't it?" "Full of interest and ambition, I conceive," said Clennam. "And imposition," added Gowan, laughing. "We won't leave out the imposition. I hope I may not break down in that, but there my being a disappointed man may show itself. I may not be able to face it out gravely enough. Between you and me, I think there is some danger of my being just enough soured not to be able to do that." "To do what?" asked Clennam. "To keep it up. To help myself in my turn as the man before me helps himself in his, and pass the bottle of smoke. To keep up the pretence as to labour and study and patience, and being devoted to my art, and giving up many solitary days to it, and abandoning many pleasures for it, and living in it, and all the rest of it. In short, to pass the bottle of smoke according to rule. But it is well for a man to respect his own vocation, whatever it is, and to think himself bound to uphold it, and to claim for it the respect it deserves, is it not? Arthur reasoned. And your vocation, Gowan, may really demand this suit and service? I confess I should have thought that all art did. What a good fellow you are, Clennam, exclaimed the other, stopping to look at him, as if with irrepressible admiration. What a capital fellow! You have never been disappointed, that's easy to see. It would have been so cruel if he had meant it that Clennam firmly resolved to believe that he did not mean it. Gowan, without pausing, laid his hand upon his shoulder and laughingly and lightly went on. Clennam, I don't like to dispel your generous visions, and I would give any money, if I had any, to live in such a rose-coloured mist. But what I do in my trade, I do to sell. What all we fellows do, we do to sell. If we don't want to sell it for the most we can get for it, we shouldn't do it. Being work, it has to be done, but it's easily enough done. All the rest is hocus-pocus. Now here's one of the advantages or disadvantages of knowing a disappointed man. You hear the truth? Whatever he had heard, and whether it deserved that name or another, it sank into Clennam's mind. It so took root there that he began to fear Henry Cowan would always be a trouble to him, and that so far as he had gained little or nothing from the dismissal of nobody, with all his inconsistencies, anxieties, and contradictions. He found a contest still always going on in his breast between his promise to keep Gowan in none but good aspects before the mind of Mr. Meagles, and his enforced observation of Gowan in aspects that had no good in them. Nor could he quite support his own conscientious nature against misgivings that he distorted and discoloured himself by reminding himself that he never sought these discoveries, and that he would have avoided them with willingness and great relief. For he could never forget what he had been, and he knew that he had once disliked Gowan for no better reason that he had come in his way. Harassed by these thoughts, he now began to wish the marriage over, Gowan and his young wife gone, and himself left to fulfil his promise and discharge the generous function he had accepted. This last week was, in truth, an uneasy interval for the whole house. Before Pet or before Gowan, Mr. Meagles was radiant, but Clennam had more than once found him alone, with his view of the scales and scoop much blurred, and had often seen him look after the lovers in the garden or elsewhere when he was not seen by them, with the old, clouded face on which Gowan had fallen like a shadow. In the arrangement of the house for the great occasion, many little reminders of the old travels of the father and mother and daughter had to be disturbed and passed from hand to hand, and sometimes, in the midst of these mute witnesses to the life they had had together, even Pet herself would yield to lamenting and weeping. Mrs. Meagles, the blithest and busiest of mothers, went about singing and cheering everybody, but she, honest soul, had her flights into storerooms, where she would cry until her eyes were red, and would then come out attributing that appearance to pickled onions and pepper, and singing clearer than ever. Mrs. Tickett, finding no balsam for a wounded mind in Buchan's domestic medicine, suffered greatly from low spirits and from moving recollections of Minnie's infancy. When the latter was powerful with her, she usually sent up secret messages importing that she was not in parlour condition as to her attire, and that she solicited a sight of her child in the kitchen. There she would bless her child's face, and bless her child's heart, and hug her child, in a medley of tears and congratulations, chopping boards, rolling pins, and pie crust, with the tenderness of an old attached servant, which is a very pretty tenderness indeed. But all days come that are to be, and the marriage day was to be, and it came, and with it came all the Barnacles who were bidden to the feast. There was Tite Barnacle from the Circumlocution Office and Mews Street, Grosvenor Square, with the expensive Mrs. Tite Barnacle, née Stiltstalking, who made the quarter-days so long in coming, and the 3 expensive Miss Tite Barnacles, double-loaded with accomplishments and ready to go off, and yet not going off with the sharpness of flash and bang that might have been expected, but rather hanging fire. There was Barnacle Junior, also from the Circumlocution Office, leaving the tonnage of the country, which he was somehow supposed to take under his protection, to look after itself, and, sooth to say, not at all impairing the efficiency of its protection by leaving it alone. There was the engaging young Barnacle, deriving from the sprightly side of the family, also from the Circumlocution Office, gaily and agreeably helping the occasion along, and treating it, in his sparkling way, as one of the official forms and fees of the church department of how not to do it. There were 3 other young Barnacles from 3 other offices, insipid to all the senses, and terribly in want of seasoning, doing the marriage as they would have done the Nile, Old Rome, the New Singer, or Jerusalem. But there was a greater game than this. There was Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle himself, in the odour of the circumlocution, with the very smell of dispatch-boxes upon him. Yes, there was Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle, who had risen to official heights on the wings of one indignant idea, and that was, my lords, that I am yet to be told that it behoves a minister of this free country to set bounds to the philanthropy, to cramp the charity, to fetter the public spirit, to contract the enterprise, to damp the independent self-reliance of its people. That was, in other words, that this great statesman was always yet to be told that it beloved the pilot of the ship to do anything but prosper in the private loaf and fish trade ashore, the crew being able, by dint of hard pumping, to keep the ship above water without him. On this sublime discovery in the great art how not to do it, Lord Decimus had long sustained the highest glory of the Barnacle family, and let any ill-advised member of either house but try how to do it by bringing in a bill to do it, that bill was as good as dead and buried when Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle rose up in his place and solemnly said, soaring into indignant majesty as the circumlocution cheering soared around him, that he was yet to be told, my lords, that it behoved him as the minister of this free country to set bounds to the philanthropy, to cramp the charity, to fetter the public spirit, to contract the enterprise, to damp the independent self-reliance of its people. The discovery of this behoving machine was the discovery of the political perpetual motion. It never wore out, though it was always going round and round in all the state departments. And there, with his noble friend and relative, Lord Decimus, was William Barnacle, who had made the ever-famous coalition with Tudor stilt-stalking, and who always kept ready his own particular recipe for how not to do it, sometimes tapping the speaker and drawing it fresh out of him with a, "First, I will beg you, sir, to inform the House what precedent we have for the course into which the honourable gentleman would precipitate us," sometimes asking the honourable gentleman to favour him with his own version of the precedent, sometimes telling the honourable gentleman that he, William Barnacle, would search for a precedent, and oftentimes crushing the honourable gentleman flat on the spot by telling him there was no precedent. But precedent and precipitate were, under all circumstances, the well-matched pair of battle horses of this able circumlocutionist. No matter that the unhappy honourable gentleman had been trying in vain for 25 years to precipitate William Barnacle into this, William Barnacle still put it to the House, and, at second hand or so, to the country, whether he was to be precipitated into this. No matter that it was utterly irreconcilable with the nature of things and course of events that the wretched honourable gentleman could possibly produce a precedent for this, William Barnacle would nevertheless thank the honourable gentleman for that ironical cheer, and would close with him upon that issue, and would tell him to his teeth that there was no precedent for this. It might perhaps have been objected that the William Barnacle wisdom was not high wisdom, or the earth it bamboozled would never have been made, or, if made in a rash mistake, would have remained blank mud. But precedent and precipitate together frightened all objection out of most people. And there, too, was another Barnacle, a lively one, who had leapt through 20 places in quick succession, and was always in 2 or 3 at once, and who was the much respected inventor of an art which he practised with great success and admiration in all Barnacle governments. This was, when he was asked a parliamentary question on any one topic, to return an answer on any other. It had done immense service, and brought him into high esteem with the Circumlocution Office. And there, too, was a sparkling of less distinguished parliamentary Barnacles, who had not as yet got anything snug, and were going through their probation to prove their worthiness. These barnacles perched upon staircases and hid in passages, waiting their orders to make houses or not to make houses, and they did all their hearing and owing and cheering and barking under directions from the heads of the family, and they put dummy motions on the paper in the way of other men's motions, and they stalled disagreeable subjects off until late in the night and late in the session, and then with virtuous patriotism cried out that it was too late, and they were sent down into the country whenever they were sent, and swore that Lord Decimus had revived trade from a swoon, and a commerce from a fit, and had doubled the harvest of corn, quadrupled the harvest of hay, and prevented no end of gold from flying out of the bank. Also these barnacles were dealt, by the heads of the family, like so many cards below the court cards, to public meetings and dinners, where they bore testimony to all sorts of services on the part of their noble and honourable relatives, and buttered the barnacles on all sorts of toasts. And they stood, under similar orders, at all sorts of elections, and they turned out of their own seats on the shortest notice and the most unreasonable terms to let in other men, and they fetched and carried and toadied and jobbed and corrupted and ate heaps of dirt and were indefatigable in the public service. And there was not a list in all the Circumlocution Office of places that might fall vacant anywhere within half a century, from a Lord of the Treasury to a Chinese consul, and up again to a Governor-General of India, but as applicants for such places, the names of some or of every one of these hungry and adhesive barnacles were down. It was necessarily but a sprinkling of any class of barnacles that attended the marriage, for there were not 200 in all, and what is that subtracted from legion? But the sprinkling was a swarm in the Twickenham cottage, and filled it. A barnacle, assisted by a barnacle, married the happy pair, and it behoved Lord Decimus Tite Barnacle himself to conduct Mrs. Meagles to breakfast. The entertainment was not as agreeable and natural as it might have been. Mr. Meagles, hove down by his good company while it highly appreciated it, was not himself. Mrs. Gowan was herself, and that did not improve him. The fiction that it was not Mr. Meagles who had stood in the way, but that it was the family greatness, and that the family greatness had made a concession, and there was now a soothing unanimity, pervaded the affair, though it was never openly expressed. Then the Barnacles felt that they, for their parts, would have done with the Meagleses when the present patronizing occasion was over, and the Meagleses felt the same for their parts. Then Gowan, asserting his rights as a disappointed man who had his grudge against the family, and who, perhaps, had allowed his mother to have them there, as much in the hope it might give them some annoyance as with any other benevolent object, aired his pencil and his poverty ostentatiously before them, and told them he hoped in time to settle a crust of bread and cheese on his wife, and that he begged such of them as, more fortunate than himself, came in for any good thing and could buy a picture to please to remember the poor painter. Then Lord Decimus, who was a wonder in his own parliamentary pedestal, turned out to be the windiest creature here, proposing happiness to the bride and bridegroom in a series of platitudes that would have made the hair of any sincere disciple and believer stand on end, and trotting, with the complacency of an idiotic elephant, among howling labyrinths of sentences which he seemed to take for high roads, and never so much as wanted to get out of. Then Mr. Tite Barnacle could not but feel that there was a person in company who would have disturbed his lifelong sitting to Sir Thomas Lawrence in full official character, if such disturbance had been possible, while Barnacle Junior did, with indignation, communicate to two vapid gentlemen, his relatives, that there was a fellow here, look here, who had come to our department without an appointment, and said he wanted to know, that, look here, if he was to break out now, as he might, for you never could tell what an ungentlemanly radical of that sort would be up to next, and was to say, look here, that he wanted to know this moment, that would be jolly, wouldn't it? The pleasantest part of the occasion by far, to Clennam, was the painfullest. When Mr. and Mrs. Meagles at last hung about Pet in the room with the two pictures where the company were not, before going with her to the threshold which she could never recross to be the old Pet and the old Delight, nothing could be more natural and simple than the three were. Gowan himself was touched, and answered Mr. Meagles, "Oh, Gowan, take care of her, with an earnest Don't be so broken-hearted, sir. By heaven, I will." And so, with the last sobs and last loving words, and a last look to Clennam of confidence in his promise, Pet fell back in the carriage, and her husband waved his hand, and they were away for Dover, though not until the faithful Mrs. Tickit, in her silk gown and jet-black curls, had rushed out from some hiding-place and thrown both her shoes after the carriage, an apparition which occasioned some surprise to the distinguished company at the windows. The said company being now relieved from further attendance, and the chief Barnacles being rather hurried, for they had it in hand just then to send a mail or two which was in danger of going straight to its destination, beating about the seas like the Flying Dutchman, and to arrange with complexity for the stoppage of a good deal of important business otherwise in peril of being done, went their several ways, with all affability, conveying to Mr. and Mrs. Meagles that general assurance that what they had been doing there, they had been doing at a sacrifice for Mr. and Mrs. Meagles' good, which they always conveyed to Mr. John Bull in their official condescension to that most unfortunate creature. A miserable blank remained in the house, and in the hearts of the father and mother and Clennam. Mr. Meagles called only one remembrance to his aid that really did him good. "It's very gratifying, Arthur," he said, "after all, to look back upon—" "The past," said Clennam. "Yes, but I mean the company. It had made him much more low and unhappy at the time, but now it really did him good." "It's very gratifying," he said, often repeating the remark in the course of the evening. "Such high company." Chapter 35. What was behind Mr. Panks on little Dorrit's hand? It was at this time that Mr. Panks, in discharge of his compact with Clennam, revealed to him the whole of his gipsy story, and told him little Dorrit's fortune. Her father was heir at law to a great estate that had long lain unknown of, unclaimed and accumulating. His right was now clear. Nothing interposed in his way. The Marshalsea gates stood open, the Marshalsea walls were down, a few flourishes of his pen, and he was extremely rich. In his tracking out of the claim to its complete establishment, Mr. Panks had shown a sagacity that nothing could baffle, and a patience and secrecy that nothing could tire. "I little thought, sir," said Panks, "when you and I crossed Smithfield that night, and I told you what sort of a collector I was, that this would come of it. I little thought, sir, when I told you were not of the Clennams of Cornwall, that I was ever going to tell you you were of the Dorrits of Dorsetshire." He then went on to detail how, having that name recorded in his notebook, he was first attracted by the name alone. How, having often found two exactly similar names, even belonging to the same place, to involve no traceable consanguinity, near or distant, he did not at first give much heed to this, except in the way of speculation as to what a surprising change would be made in the condition of a little seamstress if she could be shown to have any interest in so large a property. How he rather supposed himself to have pursued the idea into its next degree, because there was something uncommon in the quiet little seamstress which pleased him and provoked his curiosity. How he had felt his way inch by inch, and "mould it out, sir," that was Mr. Panks's expression, grain by grain. How, in the beginning of the labour described by this new verb, and to render which more the expressive, Mr. Panks shut his eyes in pronouncing it and shook his hair over them, he had alternated from sudden lights and hopes to sudden darkness and no hopes, and back again and back again. How he had made acquaintances in the prison, expressly that he might come and go there as all other comers and goers did, and how his first ray of light was unconsciously given him by Mr. Dorrit himself and by his son, to both of whom he easily became known, with both of whom he talked much, casually, but always moling, you'll observe, said Mr. Panks, and from whom he derived, without being at all suspected, 2 or 3 little points of family history which, as he began to hold clues of his own, suggested others. How it had at length become plain to Mr. Panks that he had made a real discovery of the heir at law to a great fortune, and that his discovery had but to be ripened to legal fullness and perfection. How he had thereupon sworn his landlord, Mr. Rugg, to secrecy in a solemn matter, and taken him into moling partnership. How they had employed John Chivery as their sole clerk and agent, seeing to whom he was devoted, and how, until the present hour, when authorities mighty in the bank and learned in the law declared their successful labours ended, they had confided in no other human being. So if the whole thing had broken down, sir, concluded Panks, at the very last, say the day before, the other day when I showed you our papers in the prison yard, or say that very day, nobody but ourselves would have been cruelly disappointed or a penny the worse. Clennam, who had been almost incessantly shaking hands with him throughout the narrative, was reminded by this to say, in an amazement which even the preparation he had for the main disclosure smoothed down, "My dear Mr. Panks, this must have cost you a great sum of money." "Pretty well, sir," said the triumphant Panks. "No trifle, though we did it as cheap as it could be done, and the outlay was a difficulty, let me tell you." "A difficulty," repeated Clennam. "But the difficulties you have so wonderfully conquered in the whole business," shaking his hand again. "I'll tell you how I did it," said the delighted Panks, putting his hair into a condition as elevated as himself. "First, I spent all I had of my own. That wasn't much." "I'm sorry for it," said Clennam. "Not that it matters now, though." "Then what did you do?" "Then," answered Panks, "I borrowed a sum of my proprietor." "Of Mr. Casby?" said Clennam. "He's a fine old fellow." "Noble old boy, ain't he?" said Mr. Panks, entering on a series of dry snorts. "Generous old buck, confiding old boy, philanthropic old buck, benevolent old boy, 20%. I engaged to pay him, sir, but we never do business for less at our shop." Arthur felt an awkward consciousness of having, in his exultant condition, been a little premature. "I said to that boiling-over old Christian," Mr. Panks pursued, appearing to greatly relish this descriptive epithet, "that I had got a little project on hand, a hopeful one. I told him a hopeful one, which wanted a certain small capital. I proposed to him to lend me the money on my note, which he did at 20, sticking the 20 on in a business-like way and putting it into the note to look like a part of the principal. If I had broken down after that, I should have been his grubber for the next 7 years at half wages and double grind. But he's a perfect patriarch, and it would do a man good to serve him on such terms, on any terms." Arthur for his life could not have said with confidence whether Panks really thought so or not. "When that was gone, sir," resumed Panks, "and it did go, though I dribbled it out like so much blood, I had taken Mr. Rugg into the secret. I proposed to borrow of Mr. Rugg, or of Miss Rugg, it's the same thing. She made a little money by a speculation in the Common Pleas once. He lent it at 10, and thought that pretty high. But Mr. Rugg's a red-haired man, sir, and gets his hair cut. And as to the crown of his hat, it's high. And as to the brim of his hat, it's narrow. And there's no more benevolence bubbling out of him than out of a ninepin." "Your own recompense for all this, Mr. Panks," said Clennam, "ought to be a large one." "I don't mistrust getting it, sir," said Panks. "I have made no bargain. I owed you one on that score. Now I have paid it. Money out of pocket made good, time fairly allowed for, and Mr. Rugg's bill settled. £1,000 would be a fortune to me. That matter I place in your hands. I authorize you now to break all this to the family in any way you think best. Miss Amy Dorrit will be with Mrs. Finching this morning. The sooner done the better. Can't be done too soon." This conversation took place in Clennam's bedroom, while he was yet in bed. For Mr. Panks had knocked up the house and made his way in very early in the morning, and, without once sitting down or standing still, had delivered himself of the whole of his details, illustrated with a variety of documents, at the bedside. He now said he would go and look up Mr. Rugg, from whom his excited state of mind appeared to require another back, and bundling up his papers and exchanging one more hearty shake of the hand with Clennam, he went at full speed downstairs and steamed off. Clennam, of course, resolved to go direct to Mr. Casby's. He dressed and got out so quickly that he found himself at the corner of the Patriarchal Street nearly an hour before her time, but he was not sorry to have the opportunity of calming himself with a leisurely walk. When he returned to the street and had knocked at the bright brass knocker, He was informed that she had come and was shown upstairs to Flora's breakfast room. Little Dorrit was not there herself, but Flora was, and testified the greatest amazement at seeing him. "Good gracious, Arthur! Doyce and Clennam!" cried that lady. "Who would have ever thought of seeing such a sight as this? And pray excuse a wrapper, for upon my word I really never, and a faded cheque too, which is worse. But our little friend is making me not that I need mind mentioning it to you, for you must know that there are such things a skirt, and having arranged that a trying on should take place after breakfast is the reason, though I wish not so badly starched." "I ought to make an apology," said Arthur, "for so early and abrupt a visit, but you will excuse it when I tell you the cause." "In times for ever fled, Arthur," returned Mrs. Finching. "Pray excuse me, Doyce and Clennam, infinitely more correct, and though unquestionably distant, still 'tis distance lends enchantment to the view. At least, I don't mean that, and if I did, I suppose it would depend considerably on the nature of the view. But I'm running on again, and you put it all out of my mind." She glanced at him tenderly, and resumed. "In times for ever fled, I was going to say, it would have sounded strange indeed for Arthur Clennam, Doyce and Clennam, naturally quite different, to make apologies for coming here at any time, but that is past, and what is past can never be recalled except in his own case. Poor Mr. F. said when he was in spirits, 'Cucumber,' and therefore never ate it." She was making the tea when Arthur came in, and now hastily finished that operation. "Papa," she said, all mystery and whisper, as she shut down the teapot lid, "is sitting prosingly breaking his new-laid egg in the back parlour over the City article, exactly like the woodpecker tapping, and need never know that you are here, and our little friend, you are well aware, may be fully trusted when she comes down from cutting out on the large table overhead." Arthur then told her, in the fewest words, that it was their little friend he came to see, and what he had to announce to their little friend. At which astounding intelligence, Flora clasped her hands, fell into a tremble, and shed tears of sympathy and pleasure, like the good-natured creature she really was. "For goodness' sake, let me get out of the way first," said Flora, putting her hands to her ears and moving towards the door, "or I know I shall go off dead and screaming, and make everybody worse, and the dear little thing only this morning looking so nice and neat and good, and yet so poor, and now a fortunate is she really, and deserves it too. And might I mean it to Mr. F.'s Aunt Arthur, not Doyce and Clennam, for this once, or, if objectionable, not on any account." Arthur nodded his free permission, since Flora shut out all verbal communication. Flora nodded in return to thank him and hurried out of the room. Little Dorrit's step was already on the stairs, and in another moment she was at the door. Do what he could to compose his face, he could not convey so much of an ordinary expression into it, but that the moment she saw it, she dropped her work and cried, "Mr. Clennam, what's the matter?" "Nothing, nothing. That is, no misfortune has happened. I have come to tell you something, but it is a piece of great good fortune." "Good fortune?" "Wonderful fortune." They stood in a window, and her eyes, full of light, were fixed upon his face. He put an arm about her, seeing her likely to sink down. She put her hand upon that arm, partly to rest upon it, and partly so to preserve their relative positions, as that her intent look at him should be shaken by no change of attitude in either of them. Her lips seemed to repeat, "Wonderful fortune." He repeated it again, aloud. "Dear little Dorrit, your father—" The ice of the pale face broke at the word, and little lights and shoots of expression passed all over it. They were all expressions of pain. Her breath was faint and hurried, her heart beat fast. He would have clasped the little figure closer, but he saw that the eyes appealed to him not to be moved. "Your father can be free within this week. He does not know it. We must go to him from here to tell him of it. Your father will be free within a few days. Your father will be free within a few hours. Remember, we must go to him from here to tell him of it." That brought her back. Her eyes were closing, but they opened again. "This is not all the good fortune. This is not all the wonderful good fortune, my dear little Dorrit. Shall I tell you more?" Her lips shaped, "Yes." Your father will be no beggar when he is free. He will want for nothing. Shall I tell you more? Remember, he knows nothing of it. We must go to him from here to tell him of it." She seemed to entreat him for a little time. He held her in his arm and, after a pause, bent down to his ear to listen. "Did you ask me to go on?" "Yes." "He will be a rich man. He is a rich man. A great sum of money is waiting to be paid over to him as his inheritance. You are all henceforth very wealthy. Bravest and best of children, I thank heaven that you are rewarded." As he kissed her, she turned her head towards his shoulder and raised her arm towards his neck, cried out, "Father, father, father," and swooned away. Upon which Flora returned to take care of her and hovered about her on a sofa, intermingling kind offices and incoherent scraps of conversation in a manner so confounding that whether she pressed the Marshalsea to take a spoonful of unclaimed dividends, for it would do her good, or whether she congratulated little Dorrit's father on coming into possession of 100,000 smelling bottles, or whether she explained that she put 75,000 drops of spirits of lavender on 50,000 pounds of lump sugar, and that she entreated little Dorrit to take that gentle restorative, or whether she bathed the foreheads of Doyce and Clennam in vinegar, and gave the late Mr. F. more air, no one with any sense of responsibility could have undertaken to decide. A tributary stream of confusion, moreover, poured in from an adjoining bedroom, where Mr. F.'s aunt appeared, from the sound of her voice, to be in a horizontal posture awaiting her breakfast, and from which bower that inexorable lady snapped off short taunts whenever she could get a hearing, as "Don't believe it's his doing," and "He needn't take no credit to himself for it," and "It'll be long enough, I expect, afore he'll give up any of his own money," all designed to disparage Clennam's share in the discovery, and to relieve those inveterate feelings with which Mr. F.'s aunt regarded him. But little Dorrit's solicitude to get to her father, and to carry the joyful tidings to him, and not to leave him in his jail a moment with his happiness in store for him and still unknown to him, did more for her speedy restoration than all the skill and attention on earth could have done. "Come with me to my dear father. Pray come and tell my dear father," were the first words she said. Her father, her father. She spoke of nothing but him, thought of nothing but him, kneeling down and pouring out her thankfulness with uplifted hands. Her thanks were for her father. Flora's tenderness was quite overcome by this, and she launched out among the cups and saucers into a wonderful flow of tears and speech. "I declare," she sobbed, "I never was so cut up since your mamma and papa, not Doyce and Clement for this once, but give the precious little thing a cup of tea and make her put it to her lips at least. Pray, Arthur, do. Not even Mr. F.'s last illness, for that was of another kind, and gout is not a child's affection, though very painful for all parties. And Mr. F. a martyr, with his leg upon a rest, and the wine trade in itself inflammatory, for they will do it more or less among themselves, and who can wonder? It seems like a dream, I am sure, to think of nothing at all this morning, and now mines of money, is it really? But you must know, my darling love, because you never will be strong enough to tell me all about it upon teaspoons, mightn't it be even best to try the directions of my own medical man, for though the flavour is anything but agreeable, still I force myself to do it as a prescription and find the benefit. You'd rather not? Why, no, my dear, I'd rather not, but still I do it as a duty. Everybody will congratulate you, some in earnest and some not, and many will congratulate you with all their hearts, but none more so, I do assure you, from the bottom of my own. I do myself, though sensible of blundering and being stupid, and will be judged by Arthur, not Doyce and Clennam, for this once. So good-bye, darling, and God bless you, and may you be very happy, and excuse the liberty, vowing that the dress shall never be finished by anybody else, but shall be laid by for a keepsake, just as it is, and called Little Dorrit, though why that strangest of denominations at any time never did myself, and now I never shall." Thus Flora, in taking leave of her favourite. Little Dorrit thanked her and embraced her over and over again, and finally came out of the house with Clennam and took the coach for the Marshalsea. It was a strangely unreal ride through the old squalid streets, with a sensation of being raised out of them into an airy world of wealth and grandeur. When Arthur told her that she would soon ride in her own carriage through very different scenes, when all the familiar experiences would have vanished away, she looked frightened. But when he substituted her father for herself, and told her how he would ride in his carriage, and how great and grand he would be, her tears of joy and innocent pride fell fast. Seeing that the happiness her mind could realize was all shining upon him, Arthur kept that single figure before her, and so they rode brightly through the poor streets in the prison neighbourhood to carry him the great news. When Mr. Chivery, who was on duty, admitted them into the lodge, he saw something in their faces which filled him with astonishment. He stood looking after them when they hurried into the prison, as though he perceived that they had come back accompanied by a ghost apiece. 2 or 3 collegians whom they passed looked after them too, and presently joining Mr. Chivery, formed a little group on the lodge steps, in the midst of which there spontaneously originated a whisper that the father was going to get his discharge. Within a few minutes it was heard in the remotest room in the college. Little Dorrit opened the door from without, and they both entered. He was sitting in his old grey gown and his old black cap in the sunlight by the window, reading his newspaper. His glasses were in his hand, and he had just looked round, surprised at first, no doubt, by her step upon the stairs, not expecting her until night, surprised again by seeing Arthur Clennam in her company. As they came in, the same unwonted look in both of them, which had already caught attention in the yard below, struck him. He did not rise or speak, but laid down his glasses and his newspaper on the table beside him, and looked at them with his mouth a little open and his lips trembling. When Arthur put out his hand, he touched it, but not with his usual state, and then he turned to his daughter, who had sat down close beside him with her hands upon his shoulder, and looked attentively in her face. "Father, I have been made so happy this morning." "You have been made so happy, my dear?" "By Mr. Clennam, father. He brought me such joyful and wonderful intelligence about you. If he had not, with his great kindness and gentleness, prepared me for it, father, I think I could not have borne it." Her agitation was exceedingly great, and the tears rolled down her face. He put his hand suddenly to his heart and looked at Clennam. "Compose yourself, sir," said Clennam, "and take a little time to think of the brightest and most fortunate accidents of life. We have all heard of great surprises of joy. They are not at an end, sir. They are rare, but not at an end." "Mr. Clennam, not at an end for—" He touched himself upon the breast instead of saying me. "No," returned Clennam. "What surprise?" he asked, keeping his left hand over his heart, and there stopping in his speech, while with his right hand he put his glasses exactly level on the table. "What such surprise can be in store for me?" "Let me answer with another question. Tell me, Mr. Dorrit, what surprise would be the most unlooked for and the most acceptable to you? Do not be afraid to imagine it, or say what it would be." He looked steadfastly at Clennam, and, so looking at him, seemed to change into a very old, haggard man. The sun was bright upon the wall beyond the window, and on the spikes at top. He slowly stretched out the hand that had been upon his heart, and pointed at the wall. "It is down," said Clennam. "Gone." He remained in the same attitude, looking steadfastly at him. "And in its place," said Clennam, slowly and distinctly, "are the means to possess and enjoy the utmost that they have so long shut out. Mr. Dorrit, there is not the smallest doubt that within a few days you will be free and highly prosperous. I congratulate you with all my soul on this change of fortune, and on the happy future into which you are soon to carry the treasure you have been blessed with here, the best of all the riches you can have elsewhere, the treasure at your side." With those words he pressed his hand and released it, and his daughter, laying her face against his, encircled him in the hour of his prosperity with her arms, as she had in the long years of his adversity encircled him with her love and toil and